Good evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I know some people are joining us from across the world. My name is Maria Montague. I'm the Deputy Director of the Ukrainian Institute London. We are an independent charity dedicated to championing Ukrainian culture and providing Ukrainian perspectives on global issues. And this evening, our event marks 90 years since the Stalinist regime perpetrated the Holodomor famine against Ukrainians. And with our expert panel, we will be discussing how the weaponization of starvation continues today in Ukraine and globally. The event this evening, we will have 40 minutes of discussion, and then after that, there will be a chance for you all to ask your questions. And we will be recording this event, and we'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel at a later date. So if you do ask a question later and you prefer not to be on video for the recording, we can remove that later, so just let us know. Moderating the discussion this evening, we are very privileged to have international lawyer Dr. Katerina Busol joining us. Dr. Busol is an associate professor at the Kiev Mohyla Academy and a British Academy Fellow at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. Katerina has previously worked with the Clooney Foundation for Justice, UN Women, Global Survivors Fund, and Global Rights Compliance, as well as many leading Ukrainian NGOs and state bodies. Katerina, thank you very much for moderating this evening.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much, Olesa and all the team at the Ukrainian Institute for inviting us and for convening this important discussion. This year, we are commemorating several poignant anniversaries. It's not only 90 years since the commission of man-made famine against the Ukrainians, Holodomor, but symbolically, it's also the 75th anniversary of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Notably, Raphael Lemkin, the jurist who coined the term genocide, also published an essay called Soviet Genocide in Ukraine, referring to Holodomor and wider practices of the Soviet authorities as a classical example of the international crime that he was substantiating. And preparing for this webinar today, I looked at the Journal of International Criminal Justice that published Lemkin's essay on the Soviet policies against Ukrainians. And it's interesting that the editors have noted that the document, known to Lemkin's specialists and experts in genocide, although most scholars have tended to ignore it or play it down. And today we are very privileged to have exceptional experts who will not only investigate Soviet policies towards Ukrainians 90 years ago, but also their connection to the weaponization of starvation in Russia's ongoing aggression in Ukraine, as well as the use of starvation as a method of warfare in other atrocity contexts and armed conflicts across the globe, on the African continent and in the Middle East. The colleagues whom I will introduce in a second will connect and explain how the crime of starvation is connected with other crimes, such as sieges or conflict-related sexual violence. In our multifaceted panel today, we're privileged to have Dr. Daria Mattinley, who's a lecturer in European history at the University of Chichester. Prior to that, she taught Soviet and Russian history at the University of Cambridge, where she received her doctorate. We're also happy to be joined by Catriona Murdoch, who's a partner at Global Rights Compliance, who for the last 5 years has led their starvation and humanitarian crisis workstream, working closely with the Swiss and the Dutch to amend the Rome Statute on the law of starvation. Catriona is a world-leading expert on the crime. She's also a barrister admitted to the chambers in the UK. Finally, we're joined by Professor Alex de Waal, who is an executive director at the World Peace Foundation and the research professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He has worked on the Horn of Africa and on conflict, food security, and related issues since the 1980s as a researcher and a practitioner. Currently, Alex also served as a senior advisor to the African Union High-Level Panel on Sudan and South Sudan. Colleagues, we will open our discussion with a presentation from Daria Martinly, who will provide to us the historical insight into the Soviet crimes against the Ukrainians and how starvation was weaponized, particularly in the 1932 and 33. Daria, over to you.
Thank you, Katerina, and good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today and a true privilege for me to be presenting on this topic. And as a historian, I would like to go even earlier than 1932-33, because I believe we need to look a decade earlier to understand what was happening in 1932-33 and what is happening right now in Ukraine. So you would think history is on repeat, and indeed it was. Because following October Revolution in Russia, Russia tried to rebuild, to collect its lands and rebuild itself as an empire. And if during 1919 it could defeat Ukrainian national movement by force, militarily, it could not secure support of local population of its policies and collectivization in particular. And what we see here is the link between social and national, because when you have to give up your land as a peasant, as an aspiring farmer, you have to give up your livelihood, you have to give up your lifeline to what you are, what you will be, what you can provide for your family. And of course, collectivization was not popular in Soviet Union, not least in Ukraine, where farmers and peasants had a lot to lose, and they had traditions of keeping land in the family, even though it was divided between family members. But nevertheless, there were traditions. There was no commune that was practiced, or mir, община, that was practiced in Russia. And there was a very potent national movement, which proved itself potent in a few years, several years of statehood, short-lived, but still statehood between 1917 and 1919. So we're talking about national being linked very closely to largely agrarian. 80% of population lived in the countryside as peasants, as farmers. So they had to give up their land, they have to give up their freedom ultimately. And the famine that occurred in Ukraine, that took place in Ukraine 1932-33, also took place concurrently with repressions against political elite, against the clergy, so religion, and intelligentsia. So we have, on one hand, we have political, nascent political nation in Ukraine, in the cities, due to, for a variety of reasons. So they had 10 years prior experience of a nationhood, of a statehood. And you also have social class of peasants not willing to give up their land, but also associating themselves surprisingly for the Bolsheviks, but not surprisingly for Stalin and Lenin, who understood that link between peasantry and national movement. So they associated themselves with Ukraine. And as I mentioned, in 1919, there was a peasant uprising against the Bolsheviks. More importantly, Ukrainians, both in cities and in the countryside, did not vote for Bolsheviks in the elections to Constituent Assembly, which was to reinstate Russian state, a capitalist state, before the Bolsheviks. So we know that Ukrainians didn't elect Bolsheviks. They didn't agree with their policies, and collectivization in particular, because more resistance and uprisings took place in Ukraine proportionally than anywhere else in the USSR. So we have Ukraine presenting a problem, and previous experience of subduing it by force, by the army, launching a conventional war on Ukraine against the uprising peasants, it didn't provide a solution, because Ukrainians were resisting in 1930. We have security services reporting that Soviet officials were expelled in a number of districts in Vinnytsia, Khmelnytska Oblast. And so we have a real problem, which just sent in detachments, which were sent in 1930, didn't resolve that. And moreover, we have intellectuals in Ukraine of Russian ethnic origin, such as Mykola Khmelyvy, calling to get away from Moscow, head with Moskvy. So indigenization clearly doesn't work in Ukraine. So from the perspective of the Kremlin, we see a problem, and which is articulated by Stalin in his telegrams to his envoys in Ukraine and to the Republican leadership, that we can lose Ukraine if we not act upon it. And famine, to this end, served its purpose of pacifying Ukraine, which was again articulated in the correspondence between Kremlin and Kharkiv, which was the capital at the time of Ukraine. We have that understanding that even in March 1933, quote, that the famine hasn't taught Ukrainian muzhik a lesson yet, end of quote, by Stanislav Kosior, the first secretary of the Central Committee of Ukrainian Communist Bolshevik Party. And that's in correspondence with Stalin. But indeed, it was solution that reduced population to the basic instinct of survival. When you are reduced to just longing to eat something to save your child, you are less likely to resist the policies. You are less likely to even to sing Shene Vmerla Ukraina, which was sung in the villages in 1933 even, so the Ukrainian national anthem. And in a correspondence between Kaganovich, Molotov, and Stalin, we see them linking Petlurite movement 10 years prior. So Petlura, national movement in Ukraine, with the question of grain procurement, which ultimately and crucially was what the famine was about. When you push for the grain procurement targets for Ukraine for 1932-33, which are not realistic. They were never met, lowered 3 times, but never met. Only 60%, I think it was, fulfilled. When you accompany those plans or targets for grain procurement in 1932-33 with special policies for Ukraine, which were later adopted and enforced in some other provinces, which also presented a problem in Russian Federation and in Kazakhstan, then you can see the link becomes obvious. And when the state is responsible for distribution of food after collecting, again, I'm using terms used by the perpetrators, by the state who organized the famine. So if the state is watching you, what you eat, where you can access food, where you can escape, and I'm talking about real policies adopted and enforced at the time, facilitated, as in all cases of mass violence, by ordinary people. When the state is in control, whether you eat or not, then you control that person, then you control that country, and then you can actually reach that political power. You are in the position of power to negotiate with anyone who questions what is happening in Ukraine, and you can claim, you can silence. There is no famine, as we know, was argued by the fellow travelers, journalists, of Walter Duranty in particular. So there are fake realities, surreal reality created by this state, because you control who eats and who doesn't. And it's not just removal of food, it also prevention of peasants accessing food in the fields, in the storehouses. As many of you know, the infamous law of 5 thicklets of grain or wheat, ears of wheat, of grain, and there is also meat procurement in lieu of grain procurement enforced in November 1932. Requirement of peasants to have a passport, which they were denied in order to prevent their travel to other parts of USSR, because they were, quote, so in panic about collectivization and the state of affairs in their republic. There were filtration camps to return those who escaped to the neighboring Russian districts of Russian Federation, and we're talking about thousands of people who were returned to the place of their residence. So we have obviously prevention of victim escape in the famine. So there was no freedom of movement. Peasants, Ukrainian peasants were denied passports, and those in the cities were dying too. And we see all groups that were not loyal to Soviet power in Ukraine being targeted, be it Jews in shtetls, and be it different minorities, Polish, German minorities, Mennonites, Bulgarians in South Ukraine, and of course, primarily because majority of the population were Ukrainians, and they are linked to, for example, Ukrainians are linked to Petlerites, Jews were linked to Zionism, and so on, like obviously Poles, Joseph Pilsudski at the time, Pilsudski agents, obviously. So we see how history informs politicians' decisions, and how they use that history, manipulate that history, to suggest that if we don't do this, it would be in case of war, Ukrainians would side with Poles. And we see that rhetoric that we see today as well, of linking previous experience and fears and paranoid sometimes. It's all manipulated in the language by the top leadership, and of course it all disseminated, all leveraged down all the way to district newspapers. And we see involvement of local population and ordinary people. And when I'm saying ordinary, is because most of them who facilitated the famine stayed in the positions of power, or it habituated them to violence. And it also showed what little value human life in a society like Soviet had, and for totalitarian regimes in particular. So that's a very short, very crude, just contextualization of the famine, how it was weaponized, and how all parts of Ukrainian societies were subdued, were controlled by the fear, be it for a Ukrainian writer who can lose small rations they had at the time, or a worker in A, B, or C grade of the factory and access to resources, and how it was then silenced. And yes, but short term, it obviously provided for the system that is based on the terror and violence. It provided a solution of control in Ukraine. But as we see, as soon as the terror was and repressions were removed, this crime could no longer be silenced. It contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's not just my opinion. There are other researchers of the Holodomor, Andrea Graciosi in particular, who said that was the beginning of the end. As soon as they decided to go ahead with the Holodomor, that actually laid the foundation for the dissolution of the USSR. And so you can extrapolate it on today's policies and argue that it would finish Russia. And I won't go into today's politics. I will leave it to my colleagues as well to touch upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daria, for providing a very big contextual picture of how Holodomor was perpetrated and who was participating. And we already have the questions arriving in our chat box. Please feel free to type your questions further. After the introductory remarks by two other speakers, we will turn to the questions. And I just wanted to know that Daria has very poignantly pointed it out, the three prongs of genocide against Ukrainians, which Raphael Lemkin himself devised, saying that it was an attack on Ukraine's brain, the physical extermination of intelligentsia. It was an attack on the Ukrainian soul, the physical extermination of the priests, as well as the official liquidation of the churches, as well as the attack on the farmers. However, this idea, the idea of the holistic extermination, not just physical extermination, but the gradual cultural, spiritual erasure of the nation, as devised by Raphael Lemkin, did not really land in the Genocide Convention, whose anniversary we are also marking this year. Unfortunately, currently genocide is associated only with the physical extermination. However, there are also attempts to reshape or expand this understanding. And I'm now giving the floor to Katerina Murdoch to comment on their big team's analysis of the weaponization of starvation in Ukraine, as well as how this crime interplays with other atrocity crimes which we are observing in Ukraine as well as in other armed conflicts. Katerina, over to you.
Thank you, Katia, and thank you, Daria, too, for that introduction. It was really fascinating to hear you speak about that. I think taking first then how we're seeing starvation being used as a method of warfare today in Ukraine, and then I'll turn to some of its how it interlinks with other crimes. I think from the outset of the full-scale invasion, and I should say that global rights compliance, as you'll know, Katerina, we've been based in Ukraine since 2014 and have been actively involved in working with various different civil society and the government also, and state security in previous invasion in relation to Crimea and its occupation. And so we were confident that in the very early days and in the lead up to the start of the invasion, that we would start to see these tactics play out. And really that was borne out pretty immediately from reports in the first days that these were the types of violations that we're seeing. So GRC, Global Rights Compliance, they're part currently of a UK, EU, US sponsored atrocity crimes advisory group. And on our particular programme in relation to starvation, we're 11 months into a 2-year investigation. And what we've seen in those first 11 months have really been patterns of criminality, which we've bucketed into 3 broad camps. So the first is within sieges, where we're seeing the persistent obstruction of humanitarian access and attacks directly on humanitarian workers. Mariupol being the sort of paradigm example, but also in different sieges, including Chernihiv and other areas. The second pattern is pillaging of agricultural machinery, agriculture and grain, and the blockade of ports. And I think this ties really nicely, Daria, to your comment about, agriculture being this lifeline and this sort of the cultural intrinsic link that has within Ukraine, and the impact that has on livelihoods now and going forward. And then the third bucket is the widespread and sustained attacks on critical civilian infrastructure. And there we're seeing, electricity, energy, water supplies being routinely targeted. And we saw that really acutely in last winter with the energy attacks, and we're starting to see a similar pattern again as we enter this winter. So the attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure and the deprivation of what the crime labels as objects indispensable to survival have really grave knock-on effects, both for food security and the well-being of Ukrainians, but also in the global food security and food insecure countries. So what we have been trying to kind of channel this investigation through in our engagement with a range of different state and non-state parties has been to try and understand the critically important narrative that this plays and how it can capture the criminality, not just of individual acts, but a collective pattern of behavior and the impact that has more broadly on the Ukrainian population and the society itself. And I think, and Alex can speak to this much more eloquently than I can, but when you have a country which has a recent famine in their past, it changes the nature of when these attacks happen and what that means for Ukrainian civilians and the Ukrainian population as a whole. But for us, it really is that transformation and the pattern analysis that we're doing from seemingly isolated incidents into a broader pattern that can enable the Ukrainian authorities and international authorities to build cases against mid-level and senior level Russian perpetrators. And linking to what you were saying, I think the war crime of starvation itself also opens a really clear pathway to genocide. And Alex, you'll know from Tom Dannebaum's his phraseology of starvation being a societal torture, and the destruction, again, linking Daria to what you said about how this can tear apart the fabric of a community, the intergenerational impact that has, and the long-standing consequences that you'll see beyond the humanitarian crisis or the destruction of various infrastructure. And I think maybe we'll come to that long-standing impact in relation to the Kakhovka Dam attack a little bit later. But of course, these types of incidents can form the basis for an exploration of whether that might constitute as genocidal intent. The denial of humanitarian corridors, the hindering of medical and humanitarian assistance, and the destruction of means of survival have all been recognized in previous cases as factors inviting an inference of genocidal intent. So where we've focused over the last 10 months have been on a number of different incidents. So Mariupol has been and is currently a very significant part of our pillar of our analysis. We've also been looking at the Kakhovka Dam attack, which we can talk about a little bit later. There was a similar attack in Mykolaiv on a water pipeline. And then we've been looking at attacks on distribution points. So where services in sieges or in occupied areas have been cut off, civilians queuing for bread, water, other humanitarian assistance, or evacuation points, where those distribution points themselves are then targeted. And then also we've been looking, as I mentioned before, at the attacks on the ports, the grain pillage and seizure, and that's our most recent report that just came out last week or the week before. But how that intersects with other crimes, I think, there are a number of different alternative crimes that could be used, and certainly the practice internationally and in the UK where I practice is to look at what alternative crimes might be suitable. And so, for example, where we've been investigating an attack on a water pipeline, that could also be, whilst it could be the crime of starvation, it may be an attack on a civilian object, it may be causing excessive incidental death or long-term damage to the environment, for example. It's a very sort of routine practice to see where a particular incident might best fit. So I think when we're looking at, particularly with sieges and how that intersects with a whole host of other crimes, in many ways, the work that Alex and I did previously on different conflicts, sieges have really been synonymous with starvation crimes. And whilst sieges themselves are not unlawful, it's and indeed a legitimate military tactic, conducting them in accordance with international humanitarian law is notoriously difficult. And we've forensically analysed and assessed sieges in Syria, Yemen, and now Ukraine. And of course, we're seeing very disturbing parallels, of course, with Syria, but now in relation to Gaza as well. If I just spend a couple of minutes just talking about Mariupol and how that has sort of changed some of our analysis, and then I'll go on to maybe talk very briefly about the link with sexual violence, which again is something that Alex and I did with our colleague Bridget Conley in a previous program. So Mariupol was a relatively short siege of just 13 weeks, whereas Some of the other sieges that we saw and have analysed in the context of Syria, what was different about Mariupol is it was a porous siege. So you had significant periods of people exiting. And that's been really important for us to try and understand those population movements, how free they were, whether they were forcible or not, and to understand the pattern of attacks and damage mapping occurring inside of Mariupol alongside the time that you have people exiting. There was only about a 14-day period where Mariupol was entirely closed in terms of people moving in and out. And you can start to see some of the patterns of what was being attacked and who was being allowed out before and after that. And that really starts to build a bit of a picture around broader campaigns of filtration and broader perpetrator analysis. But what we've seen is that, for the entirety of the siege, international aid was not allowed in. And we have been working with open source experts to look at the data streams and destruction data that will hope to be able to sort of pinpoint criminal attribution and pinpoint more clearly what was happening, when and by who. And this then is cross-referenced with our Ukrainian legal team in order to make some really strong legal submissions and factual analysis. So that's where we are in relation to Mariupol, and we'll be releasing that report or preliminary report in February or March. And I should say that all of our work is engaging with the ICC and with the OPG, the Office of the Prosecutor, and the regional prosecuting offices. So all of our submissions are shared and presented to them, and then shared onwards with other accountability mechanisms as well. But I think what's very clear at this point in relation to Mariupol and in other cities is that once objects indispensable are attacked, then there are the muster points or distribution points, which then are a sort of a secondary attack, where people are gathering food and water and medicine or congregating to evacuate. These are then attacked, and then you start to see a pattern as well of humanitarian workers being targeted on the sort of outside of this siege picture. But then just in terms of the context and the how this might relate with sexual violence, what I would say there is that the analogy of sexual violence and conflict and starvation as a method of war is a really strong analogy. And what you see in the context of sexual violence, which was previously viewed very much as a natural consequence of war, it was a very much a boys will be boys attitude, has now moved to being universally viewed as an abhorrent criminal act, attracting very lengthy prison sentences. But there was a fatalism to that, as there is with starvation. Sexual and gender-based violence was once passed off, as I said, as a boys will be boys, males unruliness, an inevitable consequence. And I think with starvation, the same is, or at least it's starting to shift with some of the work that Alex and I have done over the last 5 years. But there is this sort of enmeshed mythology around starvation that has created a lot of inertia and a lack of investigative and prosecutorial action. But I think what's really important is fair labeling and the symbolism around being able to accurately label what is happening to Ukrainian civilians and Syrian civilians in the context of these sieges and other attacks on objects indispensable to survival. Now, one of the chapters in the book that Alex and Bridget and I edited, our mass starvation book with Oxford University Press, there was a specific chapter on this intersection between starvation crimes and sexual and gender-based violence. And that chapter really had some groundbreaking research, and it concluded that starvation and sexual and gender-based violence are mutually reinforcing atrocity crimes. And so whereas widespread conditions of deprivation can increase the risk of starvation, sexual and gender-based violence in and of itself can also increase the risk of starvation. So there is a sort of a cycle of conduct that can be mutually reinforcing. We, in that chapter, and the research that Diane and Bridget did, was looked in the context of South Sudan, and in the context where you have, in that scenario, women and girls having to walk incredibly long distances to access water and other food because their villages have been burnt or besieged. This then increases the risk of those women being kidnapped, attacked, sexually assaulted. Likewise, in Yemen, we looked at the data that showed that where there is, severe food insecurity, the increased financial burden would be offset by an increase in child marriages, and the sort of data correlating between the two was pretty compelling. So I think there are some really central discussions around looking at how this particular crime, whilst we're very much advocating for it to be recognized independently, it of course doesn't sit in isolation. It very much sits alongside a broader pattern of criminality. So I'll pause there, and then I'm sure we can come back to some other bits.
Fiona, thank you so much for explaining so many very intricate legal particularities with so much clarity and precision. And I'm particularly grateful that you underlined the gender dimension of the crime of starvation, because like in any other context, conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine is hugely misunderstood. It's strongly associated only with rape with women. But even during the first phase of Russia's aggression against Ukraine between 2014 and 2021, already human rights NGOs such as Eastern European Center for Civic Initiatives, as well as the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, reported the resort of women to survival prostitution. And if we extrapolate that pattern onto the graver circumstances of deprivation and starvation that we have observed in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, we can presume that at least survival prostitution must have increased as well, let alone the other threats related to human trafficking that Catriona has described. And I'm also grateful, Catriona, that you've underlined this particular connotation of imposing starvation on the nation that has already been deeply traumatized by this. I think this collective trauma and the consideration of it is very important, not just for mere legal proceedings, but actually for transitional justice, for the wider reckoning and wider, more nuanced support to survivors, about which we will speak later. And finally, last but not least, I'm giving the floor to Alex Deval, who's done the amazing work across the globe countering starvation. And Alex, we will be very grateful to hear your observations whether we have done something better as a humanity in countering starvation. I know that you and your team have really contributed to adding starvation as a crime punishable in non-international armed conflicts into the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But have there been any more advancements, or are we still in a very bad situation? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Katerina, and thank you, Daria, and Catriona as well, and for all of you for joining on this solemn anniversary, when I think we should preface anything we say by just reflecting and issuing our condolences, because these the crimes of the Holodomor may be 9 decades ago, but that doesn't make them, unhealed wounds. And actually, that's where I'd like to start, because I want to sort of step back a little bit and put those insights that we've had from Daria and from Catriona in a bigger context, very, very briefly, and look at 3 types of crime and malfeasance. And the first is denial. And one of the peculiarly painful things about the aftermath, the legacy of mass starvation, of famine, is the pain that is felt by individuals, families, and communities, and the pain that is doubled by the very common almost ubiquitous denial of that reality. It's interesting when the Irish came to commemorate the what I would call the Great English Famine in Ireland, because it was designed in London. The Great English Famine in Ireland of the 1840s. It took them about 150 years to do so, and it's interesting to reflect why. And I think one of the key reasons is that for an individual who's been through famine, the abiding memory is actually of being in what Primo Levi calls the gray zone. The life of the hungry person is a life also of inflicting cruelties as well as suffering them. So if you are a mother, you will be forced to make the choice. Do I provide medicine for this child or this child? You will turn away your starving neighbors from your door. You will be forced to sell the treasured heirlooms inherited from your grandmother at a knockdown price. Young women may go and sell their bodies, and the humiliations of that, and also the sense of cruelty and betrayal of the people who benefited in a micro way from buying things at knockdown prices, from buying sex, from hoarding small amounts of grain. This is what is remembered, and that's why people don't want to talk about it for so long. And the fact of recognizing starvation as a crime committed on a collectivity is therefore an act of emancipation. It's an act of being able to allow the survivors to say, it was not our fault. Someone did it to us. And here we see a very clear parallel with sexual violence and the Me Too movement. So one of the most important things, even decades, even 150 years on, is to be able to shed that self-blame, that shouldering of guilt among the survivors. And so the denial of memory is very, very important. And of course, in the case of Ukraine and the Holodomor, that is very, very salient, because it was Viktor Yushchenko who in 2005 began officially to commemorate the Holodomor as an act of genocide by the Soviet state. But then 5 years later, his successor reverted to the Russian position of this being a so-called common tragedy, and the language around that and the denial is weaponized. And this brings us on to another element that is very, very common, which is the denial of famine as it is ongoing. Now, my former professor at Oxford, Amartya Sen, wrote a very important piece back in the 1980s, in which he said in which he was reflecting on the ability of independent India to overcome famines, in contrast to China, Mao's China, where they had undergone the worst famine of the 20th century, which killed about 30 million people, a famine that was thoroughly suppressed. It was not known about in the rest of the world for decades afterwards. And Amartya Sen came to the conclusion that the most powerful tool in overcoming famine was having a free press, competitive elections, freedom of organization, and association and information. And so the denial of famine is intrinsic to the perpetration of famine. And in that regard, one of the most demoralizing things for people and communities who are suffering starvation is partly when the world denies that it's happening, but also when the world says, oh, this is a natural disaster, or it's the outcome of poverty. They don't turn around and say, this is a crime inflicted by a government. and that's a very, very common phenomenon. The second sort of element that I just want to reflect on very briefly is the weaponization of economic statecraft, and the Russian blockade of Ukrainian ports was an unusual blockade in that it was stopping food from getting out rather than from food getting in. And of course, what it was intended to do was as an act of economic warfare and sabotage against the Ukrainian economy, and it was successful to some degree in that regard. But it also reflected a broader phenomenon of which we have seen, particularly in the last 10 years, resurgent of the tools of economic statecraft being used to inflict deprivation. And of course, it's not just Russia that does that. We need to be very aware of the extent to which the United States in particular also uses tools of economic sanctioning and blockade, etc. And what we are seeing is a global war economies developing, the Western one and one centered particularly on China and the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then increasingly a number of Middle Eastern countries. And that economic warfare, that weaponization of financial tools in particular, is shifting the burden of hunger to the global south, to those who are least able to withstand it. So we see, deepening poverty and precarity across many parts of the Middle East, Central Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa, and the readiness of both blocs. I mean, the United States perhaps and Western Europe perhaps being a more cohesive bloc than the coalition arraigned against it, as well as that sort of material deprivation. What we see is a degradation of norms, so that in the Israeli onslaught on Gaza in the last few weeks, in the Saudi and Emirati war of starvation against Yemen, states being quite prepared to tolerate wars of starvation when undertaken by its allies. And that normative degradation that Russia is obviously a very major culprit of, but the United States and Western countries are also complicit in doing, is, I think, contributing to point number 3, which is what Triona and I and colleagues have been working on, which is the violations of the laws of war, international and crimes against humanity and crimes of genocide, with respect to inflicting starvation crimes. And this project for me began a few years ago because I'd written a lot on this topic in the 80s and early 90s, and about 10 years ago I began to reflect, why was it that the famines and acts of forced mass starvation that I had researched so intensively in the 80s and early 90s seemed to be disappearing? And then during the period of doing that research, they came back, and we saw the returns of famines, and most particularly the returns of man-made famines perpetrated in Yemen, in South Sudan, in Somalia, in Nigeria, in Syria, in Ethiopia, and a host of other countries, and the pace of this being accelerating. And I think what we are seeing is, unfortunately, even while we were working to get stronger international law, revisions, the amendments to the Rome Statute, UN Security Council Resolution 2417, that very clearly says that starvation as an act of war can be a war crime. The general international environment became much more permissive for the commission of these crimes in a very large number of places. And what I really hope is that the pushback, the intolerance, number one, of Russian crimes in Ukraine, but also of Israeli crimes in Gaza, of Saudi and Emirati crimes in Yemen, Ethiopian crimes, etc., will allow us to restore some global norms in this regard. But let me leave it at there so we have some discussion going forward.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you for such a deep, both historical and geographical overview. And I found 2 points particularly important, is that how you said that the denial of a famine is a part of a crime. And that, of course, connects us to the reckoning, and again, to the justice efforts that we are proposing to survivors, which should not be just constrained to the courts. And the second point, I was wondering about the impact on the contemporary weaponization, on famine, on mostly global South nations, as you have mentioned, and even from a practical political perspective, how tricky it is for Ukraine to raise the issues of starvation, the historical analysis of starvation conducted by the Brits in Ireland, as you mentioned, or against the Bengali in India historically, while also needing the support of this previous perpetrators in current justice efforts against Russia. These are the questions we can explore further, and I'm very grateful to you, colleagues, for already posting the questions in a chat. I will start with reading them first, but I'm also inviting you to raise your electronic hands and to ask your questions out aloud. Now, going back to Holodomor, Irina Marchuk is asking, and if I may, I will direct this question to Daria, as to we usually speak about Holodomor as being perpetrated by Russia and Bolsheviks. And what about the Ukrainians as part of the Communist Party? Were they complicit? Did they manage to avoid the perpetration of Holodomor? Daria, could you comment on that, please?
Oh, and I will echo in what Alex has already said, actually, because in cultural memory of the Holodomor created in diaspora, as well as by some Soviet writers, and more prolifically after the independence of Ukraine was pronounced, it is the other. It's ethnically different, it's prodigal son, or the outcast of the village, and or disillusioned true believer, but the accepting that it was perpetrated by ordinary people in cultural memory is rare, and it was only by Vasily Grossman or Yevhen Hutsalo and a few other writers. Majority portray them as Russians, Jewish, and we have all these tropes still pervading in cultural memory of the Holodomor. The truth is, as with other cases of mass violence and genocides, it is ordinary people, men and women, and sometimes young people, as young as pioneers. 500,000 of pioneers and komsomols were employed to guard the fields in summer 1933. But all these perpetrators are motivated, have the same motivations as perpetrators of other cases of mass violence, and I'm using Alet Smolar's overarching typology that you have trained perpetrators, militia or police, who are trained by profession to perpetrate violence, and then you have profiteers, you have so professionals or trained profiteers, you have sadists, but they are the minority, but they loom large in cultural memory. Then you have true believers, also in political violence studies, they are also 5%, also the minority. The other two groups are more populous, and we are talking about conformists or followers, who sometimes constitute up to 65% of all perpetrators. And in case of the Holodomor, they were collective farmers, and who would, because the mechanism was so split into separate actions that on their own did not live, for example, of starvation. If grain was removed from my neighbors and the head of the collective farmers asked me to take it to the train station, I do not see the immediate effect of my actions. So and the mechanism of Holodomor started not just in 1932-33. We are talking about collectivization that made it possible, that led to the dire state of the agriculture, and then obviously unrealistic grain procurement for quotas. They obviously destroyed Ukrainian countryside. And finally, there is one group of perpetrators, the sixth group, which is called vulnerable perpetrators, and Alex mentioned them. Mothers, for example, teachers, and others who were in a vulnerable position, and their vulnerability was used by the regime against them. So if I don't go to search my neighbor's house, my neighbors will come and search mine, or my husband will be repressed, or my children will be taken away from me, and so on. So that's on perpetrators, but I already also wrote about that.
Thank you very much, Daria. And we have a second question, which I will direct, if possible, both to Catriona and Alex de Waal, but also expand on the question a little bit. It's the question from Anna Prozai, and Anna is asking whether it's possible to punish Russia for Holodomor in 2023. But I was just wondering, perhaps we could look at this question from two angles, whether the accountability just narrowly for Holodomor is possible, or whether we could connect the patterns of Russia's imperial, Soviet, and current Kremlin's criminality in a particular way in its policies towards Ukraine, including in the ongoing aggression, and also to say that these methods of starvation and the possible genocidal intent or prosecutorial policy are actually rooted in from many years ago. Catriona, over to you, and then Alex.
Thanks, Katerina. I think it's a very interesting question. I think on the narrow, in terms of how you would go about prosecuting or investigating, it'd be very difficult because obviously the perpetrators are no longer alive. That's not to say that there couldn't be some form of truth-telling or people's tribunal where this was forensically explored. And survivors, family members, survivors may want to bring forward their testimonies and share it in that capacity. So more of a transitional justice angle than a sort of direct criminal accountability. But I think in terms of the more broader question that you raise, I think it's a really interesting one, and certainly the context. And I think you mentioned it before in your comment. I think to Daria's. Or maybe it was in mine, but around this kind of collective trauma piece and what that means. And I think it's a really interesting point and a really critical one, because one of the other sort of intersecting crimes that we continually look at in the context of the current aggression is the crime of terror. And I think it captures a lot of the conduct and what we're understanding from the communities that we're engaged with, the fear and terror that they have. And we saw this being routinely prosecuted in other sieges in Yugoslavia. And I think the context there, because of that history and because of the fear around that mass famine, it perpetuates a terror. And certainly I would say that the context and the history of what we're seeing, and then, as Daria mentioned, in many ways repeating itself in the current context, or strands of it, would be a critical part of the factual narrative of any legal submission in any legal case. And certainly in the communications that we'll be presenting to the ICC, it will form part of that factual narrative. What I would say, just on the flip side, and it's sort of slightly doesn't really answer the question, but I think it is also interesting because it presents that history and investigative challenge, because I think, and we saw this to some extent in South Sudan, when you are dealing with communities who in their recent or not so recent, but recent collective history have endured a mass starvation, mass famine event, it changes their perception of what starvation looks like. And I think it's challenging in some ways in relation to Ukraine because of that backdrop. Because when you talk to prosecutors, investigators, or affected communities about, starvation, they immediately go to that reference of, well, this, we're not seeing, people dying of starvation. We're not, outside of the context of, smaller numbers in Mariupol, for example. But we're not seeing these huge swathes of mass mortality that they have seen in their recent history. And I think from an investigative point of view, that does present challenges in terms of being able to frame and engage. And again, this point that sort of Alex makes, which I think is just so beautifully executed around that emancipation point and trying to understand and engage with the community to say, well, even irrespective of, we're not seeing a mass mortality in relation to what's happening in Ukraine at present, you are still being directly impacted by these, denial and destruction of objects indispensable to survival. So I think that's a long answer, and I'll pass over to Alex.
Thank you very much, Catriona. Over to you, Alex.
I would simply add that that acts of apology can be very powerful, and I think the any criminal process 90 years on is almost impossible. But what is possible is for the Russian state, the Russian people, to apologize for what was done in the name of the Soviet Union, and I'm not familiar with exactly the extent to which one would hold the Russia as such as against the Soviet Union responsible, and I would defer to Daria on that. But acts of contrition and apology are enormously important.
I will briefly add that there was a criminal case in 2010, and which the top perpetrators were posthumously obviously convicted and condemned. It was all conducted by the Ukrainian state, SBU, but on local level, it would be impossible to do that. The perpetrators are not there, and their families, in many cases in the villages where I worked, intermarried, which makes it very complicated, and memories intertwined and entangled. And I would agree with Alex's suggestion.
Thank you very much, Daria and Alex. And we have a question to Catriona. I don't know whether you can respond to it, but do you have any idea why the UN High Commission of Human Rights has not updated the number of Ukrainian casualties since late September? And I was wondering whether, after responding to this question, you could continue on analyzing the connection between the crime of starvation, and you mentioned your work on the Kakhovka dump and the wider crimes affecting the environment. Thank you.
I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint. Who was it? I'm going to disappoint. I don't have any information as to why why that number hasn't been updated. I mean, again, Alex's colleague Bridget Conley has done some extensive work on counting death tolls, and that's, the analysis is incredibly complicated, but I'm afraid I don't have any information on that. I don't know whether there's been an escalation in certain areas where they've had access previously, or whether there's just been a gap in their data. But we are in touch with them, with the Commission, regularly, but I don't have anything on that. And then just in terms of Kakhovka, and I think, Katia, it's a really, it's for such a seismic event, for it to have kind of gone, the profile of it to have been reduced so quickly in recent months. I mean, inevitably in many ways, given the competing headlines at the moment, but I think it is critical to raise just how significant the impact of that dam has been, both on livelihoods and on sort of broader environmental concerns. So we've been looking at this from the Starvation Mobile Justice Team perspective through the lens of starvation, but we also have an environmental mobile justice team that are looking at through that lens. And of course, you know, there's overlap in between. But what we did on that, within the sort of first days of the attack, we tasked our open source providers, and we were able to make some really quick early findings in terms of units that may have been responsible. And then we also had team members that were down at the impact site with the Ukrainian government and also with the ICC. So we produced and have shared a number of intelligence with the government and with the ICC, but our initial findings that we've made public contained a couple of really key findings, which were later corroborated the 2 days after we released that by a really great New York Times investigative report. So what we were able to say is that there was a high probability that the damage was caused by a pre-emplaced explosive at critical points along the dam. We ruled out a number of different hypotheses. We had weapons analysis, imagery experts, and forensic engineers that sort of assessed the way in which the dam was attacked. We were then able to link it to a particular motorized rifle brigade within the Russian forces. And we were able to rule out very, very quickly that there didn't appear to be any valid military objective on or near the dam at the time. And we were also able to assess that there was no warning for civilians to minimize the severe loss that they endured during the dam. And we did that through the use of some mobile device data that we were able to aggregate. And then we looked at the impediments to the humanitarian response, and that civilians themselves, as they were trying to flee, were continually experiencing shelling. But just to give some headlines here in terms of the scale of the impact of this, there were 37,000 homes that were damaged. About 15% of those are totally beyond repair. Most families have left their homes and have been unable to return. The water has damaged water supply networks, drinking water treatment, septic tanks. And as of July of this year, there was still around about 1 million people that were impacted by a catastrophic lack of access to water. And that's sort of fresh water, but also water for the sources. Around 1,000 hectares of cropland were flooded on either side, with an estimated 1,000 or over 1,000 households experiencing flooding in their rural kind of subsistence plots and kitchen gardens. The irrigation systems for the Kakhovka Reservoir, which is where our team actually visited, again had to transition entirely to rain-fed irrigation, which, as we anticipate and studies have shown, will have decreased the yield by about 70% and the likely loss of 2 whole harvests. 94% of the farmland in Kherson is dehydrated. I mean, the list really goes on in terms of the impact here. And again, as you've mentioned, it really has just fallen outside of the purview of what this looks like. So we've been looking, as I say, at this as an attack as an object indispensable to survival. The Security Service of Ukraine, Kherson, and the RPO have themselves opened proceedings under ecocide, but also under the violations of international humanitarian law under their own criminal code. So they have 2 ongoing investigations looking at that. Because of the dam itself having heightened protection under international humanitarian law, even if there was found to be a valid military objective situated on or near the dam, it still would be prohibited from being attacked if it would cause severe loss amongst the civilian population. And I think it's, you know, it's really indisputable, even at this early point, that severe losses have certainly manifested and continue to do so. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Catriona. And I was wondering whether we could direct the question from Sue Diamond about the likelihood of Russian state making an apology. Daria, perhaps you could assess it from a regional historical perspective, and then I would kindly ask Alex to assess the successful examples perhaps of an apology, not necessarily for the crime of starvation, because it's interesting how such a seemingly easy symbolic act still is so hard for many countries, especially former empires, to make. First, Daria, over to you.
I'll be brave. Not in current Russia, no, it would not be possible. And up until even before the invasion, the Holodomor was the apple of discord between Ukrainian and Russian historians. Russian argument goes as brought the devastation, and there was no intent to starve peasants. And more importantly, all peoples of the USSR suffered. But we now know from research and archival documents that, and in particular by one Russian historian who now works in the West, Ekaterina Naumenko, who showed after 10 years of archival research that Ukrainians suffered high mortality rate in Russian federations that their Russian neighbors in those districts where they lived compactly, and Ukrainian districts in Russian Federation. So even within Russian Federation, Ukrainians were more likely to die from starvation than Russians. And that research was now published, and after 10 years, so it's presented and peer-reviewed. And finally, the policies. We have the policies of Ukrainians prohibited from traveling into Russian Federation from February 1933, so they could not escape the famine. There were no such travel ban on Russians in Russian Federation, apart from Volga region, which followed suit in 1933. And obviously, nomads and during sedentarization and collectivization in grain procurement in Kazakhstan were prevented from leaving the Republic too. So we see specific policies that targeted Ukrainians. So for Russians, I would like to hope as an optimist that it would happen one day, but not in the foreseeable future, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Daria. Alex, over to you.
So it is remarkably difficult to get state apologies, and even when culpability is very clear and you have a state that is sensitive to these issues. So the German apology for the genocide by starvation, primarily against the Herero of Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, took a very long time and is still incomplete. And the British government has been notoriously reluctant to issue anything resembling an apology for any colonial crimes committed. So it's obviously, as Daria said, inconceivable for the current Russian regime to issue an apology. And I think I fear it will be pretty difficult for any successor government to do so. But there are opportunities for pushing this at the level of citizens or municipalities or civil society, or there will be opportunities, let's hope, in the future, which fall short of an official state apology, but would nonetheless be meaningful.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much, all dear colleagues, our speakers and the guests today. And I think the line that we all agree on here, lawyers, historians, political scientists, sociologists, is that narratives matter and history matters. The work by Raphael Lemkin, to which I referred in the opening of the webinar, Soviet Genocide in Ukraine, is just 4 pages long. And yet during the very beginning of Russia's onslaught on Ukraine in 2014, Russia referred this 4-page document to the list of extremist literature, and it's banned in Russia. And I think it's very important that in our work, be it the work of a lawyer, of a literature scholar, of a historian, we refer to these narratives and we show how crimes rarely are rooted just in present. They really have this painful legacy. And it's also important that in the responses that we propose, in justice responses that we propose to these crimes, that these should be also much broader. They should not be confined just to courts. And these symbolic responses, be that an apology or the opening of the archive, they actually matter a lot because they help to solidify the nuanced record, historical record and present record of the atrocities. It is great that we're speaking about Holodomor today with much more nuance and with much more connection to Russia's current policies, as well as to others' policies employing starvation across the globe. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks a lot to Maria, Olesa, and all the team of the Ukrainian Institute London. And see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katya, for these very powerful closing words. And thank you to all of our speakers for such an insightful and wide-ranging discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I've just put in the chat the link to join our newsletter. Please continue following our work, and we hope to see you at another event, either in person here in London or online. And I hope you will have a lovely rest of your evening or rest of your day, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Maria. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.